Welcome back to the special Hanukkah edition of Peshat and Derash in the book of Genesis. We are not going to be looking at the book of Genesis this week because I'm going to be bringing you a special Hanukkah session, a Shiur. But I will tell you that the part of our lesson having to do with Peshat and Derash is definitely in play. Hey, Tom. It's definitely in play, and I want to give it a little bit of an introduction so that I can you can know where I'm coming from. What we've done so far in our class, in the first 8 sessions, is we've spent a lot of time differentiating between the pshat that's found in the text and the midrashim, the midrash, which has had a number of different takes, most of which are legends or tales or myths or stories that are not found in the text, but they're there, as we've come to understand, because the authors of those midrashim have brought those midrashim with the express purpose of giving us a lesson or communicating to us some kind of social, moral, or ethical understanding that is not found necessarily in the words of the text itself, but we've come to understand it because of these variants. Now, what's interesting is that most of the time, it comes about, these midrashim come about as a result of somebody saying something in the verse doesn't make sense. It's asking, explain me somehow. So, for example, when God said to Avraham, I took you out of Ur Kasdim. So the rabbis asked the question, what is Ur Kasdim? And they say, Ur sounds like or. So we'll tell a story about Nimrod throwing Avraham into a fiery furnace because the word Ur sounds like the word or. All right, so it's a push, it's a stretch, but it's a nice story that is there to tell us that Abraham was destined, because of his monotheistic leanings, to be a great example to those who are looking to identify with somebody who worships God in such a zealous way. That, my friends, is the Midrash Agadah, the legends that come about in a book like Bereshit, like Genesis, where there's not a lot of law that comes with it. The best I can give you with regards to law in the book of Bereshit that comes from Midrash is, and I hope you have your Tanachim with you. This is there's a trivia question that is asked, how many mitzvot are found in the book of Bereshit? Anybody know the answer to that trivia question? No, the answer is not 0. We have Pru Urvu Umil'u et haaretz. That's 1. And there are actually 3 others. So we have a total of 4. I can't name them right now. But in chapter 17 of the book of Bereshit, look at verse 23 of chapter 17. I'm going to write that down in the chat room. That's Genesis 17:23. If you'll take a look at that, this is where God mandates the law of Brit Milah, of circumcision. And what do we have? And by the way, I'm doing this for one particular reason, and that is so that I can say that we're still learning Peshat and Derash from the book of Genesis. So I'm checking that box off. So we're told, Vayikach Avraham et Yishmael beno v'et kol yelidei veito v'et kol miknat kaspo kol zachar b'anshei beit Avraham vayamol et besar orlatam be'etzem hayom hazeh ka'asher diber ito Elohim. So Abraham took Ishmael and all of the males in his household, and he circumcised them on that day, that very day. Then later on, we're told that, where is this section that says on the 8th day? It's earlier, verse 12. Verse 12, we're told, Uven shmonat yamim yimol lachem kol zachar ledorotechem. Throughout the generations, every male among you shall be circumcised at the age of 8 days. So what happened? These two verses, the pshat is circumcise your household. In the future, it's going to be like for Yitzchak, it's going to be at 8 days. The verse says in verse 23, Be'etzem hayom hazeh, on that very day. What does the words Be'etzem hayom hazeh mean? On that very day, that the mitzvah is, the mitzvah d'oraita, the Torah mitzvah is that we are supposed to circumcise the child, the male child, on the 8th day. In fact, we are supposed to go to great lengths to make sure that if health allows it, for the child to be circumcised on the 8th day, not the 7th day, not the 9th day. To the point where, what happens when Milah, the Brit Milah, falls on Shabbat?
You have a Brit Milah on Shabbat.
Why?
Because it's Zodocher Shabbat. It's more important to have it.
And the question, how is it more important? I thought, Tom, Tadir v'she'eno Tadir, Tadir Kodem. That which is frequent versus that which is less frequent, and I would suggest to you that a circumcision for Brit Milah is pretty infrequent.
We hope so.
Relative to Shabbat, that's right. So if we have, there's a rule, a rabbinic rule, that if you have frequent versus infrequent, which one takes precedent? It's the frequent. So that's why we say, V'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Shabbat v'yom tov, and not Yom Tov v'Shabbat, because the frequent gets precedent over the infrequent. So that flies in the face, that rabbinic law flies in the face of Milah on Shabbat. And in fact, there are 3 otot, there are 3 signs in our Torah, and they are the sign of circumcision, Brit Milah, Beini uvein bnei Israel, oti leolam, the sign of Shabbat, and v'haya lachem leot al yedchem v'hayu letotafot beineinechem, the sign of tefillin. So, Tom, you're going with the notion of which is more important. So if we have tefillin versus Shabbat, both of which are signs, what happens there? We do Shabbat. Shabbat wins. You don't put tefillin on Shabbat. If we have tefillin, Shabbat versus circumcision, the reason, it's not because it's more important, because Tadir v'she'eno Tadir, Tadir Kodem, you should be going with the more frequent first, and so Shabbat should win yet again versus Milah. Matt?
I think the circumcision is grandfathered in, I would say. It comes first in the Torah. There was no Torah given on Mount Sinai when Abraham was circumcising everybody.
Okay. I could give you examples as to why that particular approach doesn't work. For example, another mitzvah is pru urvu, be fruitful and multiply, but that doesn't, that's not something that we are obligated to do because of its coming first in the text. It's when opportunity provides for itself. Matt?
I would just respond to that Abraham couldn't have been born if it wasn't pru urvu, so he wouldn't have existed. That still
That's
came
true.
first.
You're right. I'm talking about prioritization, which takes precedence. And so because the word in the text is be'etzem hayom hazeh, which is repeated in verse 26 of chapter 17. Be'etzem hayom hazeh nimol Avraham v'Yishmael beno. On that exact day, he was circumcised. We have that word be'etzem. And the rabbis who did midrash said, the use of the word of the word be'etzem tells us that it is something that we need to do on the 8th day as a priority. That's called midrash halacha, to be differentiated from midrash agadah, which is a nice story that we tell, which we've been doing in our class since the beginning. But midrash halacha has a different piece to it. And that is that it is using the same method of, hey, what's going on in this text? And those of you who are daveners, we get a dose of how do we use exegesis? How do we interpret text in order to derive law? Every morning when we recite Rabbi Ishmael Omer, Bishlosh Esrei Midot HaTorah Nidreshet Bahem, there are 13 hermeneutical devices through which we can understand the midrash halacha of our Torah. So we have a mechanism to do that. Another great example is in the book of Shmot. We are told ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, yad tachat yad, regel tachat ragel, tachat tachat tachat. You know, we have all sorts of possibilities.
But that's different, isn't it? Like in that example, isn't it kind of watered down?
Bob, you call it watered down. I call it midrash halacha, where the rabbis say it's not removing a tooth for a tooth, and it's not giving an eye for an eye, but rather the rabbis say God meant mammon, that it's a financial compensation. That is midrash halacha, because it doesn't say it in the text. If it didn't say it and we were to take the text literally, we would be a nation of blind and toothless citizens, right? But that's not what the rabbis say. Let's not water it down. Let's say that that's really what God intended. And that's midrash halacha. Yes, Shoshana.
Okay, so the problem I have with what was just said, the words be'etzem hayom hazeh appear in relation to doing Brit Milah on Abraham's family and all the other people, not with the words on the 8th day. And the Brit Milah in Pasuk, I think it was 23, clearly none of them were eight days old. They were already born and part of the Abraham compound. But the Chazal, I assume, are taking these words, Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh, and superimposing it on Pasuk Yud Bet, which said it should be on the 8th day.
And Shoshana, that is exactly what the rabbis did, because they had an agenda. And I'm not calling it a nefarious agenda. I am calling it using the text in their manner in order to justify something that has been established. And they knew it had been established this way from the very beginning. Your description was 100% right on. And that is that, yes, you are saying that Be'etzem did speak to an historical event in our Torah, but because of verse 12 that says on the 8th day, that's when Jewish boys should be circumcised, they made that leap. And I will fight to the death for the rabbis to make those leaps, because that is, they want to say, this is our legal system. It is a divine system. And God has given us the authority to actually legislate based on what we believe God wants from us. That comes from where in Deuteronomy it says, Lo b'shamayim hi, that the Torah is no longer in heaven, but it's here on earth for us to try and figure out what God wants. Joel.
So then how did the rabbis justify not doing the circumcision on the 8th day if health didn't permit it?
Pikuach nefesh doche et hakol, that health trumps everything. And so therefore, if there's even a slightest health issue, and for an 8-day-old baby, we're talking there's a likelihood that there's going to be an issue, then that overrules the notion of Be'etzem Hayom Hazeh.
Yeah, I had my Brit Milah on the same day as my Pidyon Ben.
Ah, okay. So then I got to say this. The best thing about Judaism, for me anyway, is that the rabbis and the evolution of the halachic system is so flexible in so many ways that, it's really great because we have a structure, we have a framework, but there's so much flexibility and the rabbis built it in. Bob.
So if it's so flexible, how come they can't change the divorce laws so women could get a get, or could give a get? I mean, it seems to me, based on the flexibility argument, they could say, well, it wasn't intended that somebody should just withhold a get, for years.
When there's a difficulty finding ways in the literature, then there is even a clause that the rabbis put in that says, that there is even a time to enact an emergency law. So Bob, in 1953, and I'm going to digress in answer to your question, in 1953, a genius of a scholar whose name was Shaul Lieberman of blessed memory, was an instructor at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He said, I am committed to the halachic system, but this notion of a recalcitrant husband who will not give a get to his wife is untenable in Judaism. It can't be this way. We've got to do something. He put together a Lieberman clause. It was named after him, obviously, but the Lieberman clause was inserted into the ketubah that said that if the couple gets divorced civilly and there is no get given, that in accepting this ketubah, the husband agrees to go before a beit din of 3 rabbis who will then instruct him as to what to do next. Because he was a part of the conservative establishment, YU, Yeshiva University, who said that halachically, there's every reason to embrace the Lieberman clause, but we can't do it. We can't allow it to go into the ketubah because he's from a conservative establishment and therefore he has dirt on his hands and so on. And so it didn't get universalized, but it is a remedy, Bob, for the issue that you raised. And even today, there is what we have is a prenuptial agreement. There are those who still get married with the Lieberman clause, either in the document, in the ketubah itself, or as a separate document. There are remedies within the halachic system, and that confirms my statement. But there are those who don't see it that way, and I accept that there are people who don't see it that way, even with all of the problems that ensue from their looking at it from a different standpoint. But I can understand it because not all midrash halacha became halacha l'ma'aseh, became practical applications of our law. It's a part of the ongoing process, and it's my opinion, Bob, that ongoing process of determining halacha continues, even to today. And so when COVID hit, and the question of davening in a minyan versus davening by ourselves, it became a new old law, because there are those who have said, and this is really to your point, there are those who say we have to, halacha states that we must daven in a minyan. And there are other very respected rabbis who say, no, you must not daven in a minyan, because pikuach nefesh is what I understand that these rabbis would say. Pikuach nefesh doche et hakol, it supersedes the need to daven in a minyan because one's life could be in danger. That was when we first didn't know all of the pieces of how COVID affected us. That's a part of this ongoing evolution of halakha, which in my opinion has not stopped even at this moment. Okay? Thank you, Bob. Yes, Tom.
I just wanted to a very short comment, Bob. The reason why we have this problem about divorce is that the rabbinical courts are been taken over not by Orthodox Jews, but by the Haredi Jews, and it's it's basically, as I see it, a sect. They don't want to make any changes. They refuse to admit truth, and we won't go into it.
Thank you.
But that's why
Okay.
we have this problem, and they refuse they retroactively cancel conversions of like these very reform rabbis like Rabbi Druckman and stuff like that. If you get my drift, it's an absurd situation that they're running this country.
Okay, Tom, I have two comments. Number one is that absurd situation, as you called it, is not new to the state of Israel. In the 19th century, there was a rabbi by the name of, that was called the Chatam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, I believe. Moshe was his first name. Anyway, he is famous for the aphorism, Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. So anything new, the Torah forbids. So this is not new stuff, Tom. So, but it's a part of the dynamism of halachic Judaism, that there are different lenses. Now we're talking about halachic lenses as opposed to interpretive lenses through which the halacha is seen, which is the segue to what I want to talk about today, and that is Hanukkah and cheese. All right, so if you can open up your source material to what we sent you about Hanukkah and cheese, I will tell you that we're going to follow the sources. But before we do that, I just want to give you a little bit of a background. And that is, there is only one mitzvah on the books for our observance of Hanukkah. Everything else is gravy, as it were. And that is Pirsuma Nisa, the publicizing of the miracle of Hanukkah. Everything else, even though we do say Asher Kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu likrot hahalel, that is a later addition that we sing Hallel every day of Hanukkah. But that's a rabbinic enactment that the rabbis say we're going to call it a mitzvah anyway. But the one mitzvah that comes to us that is essential is the lighting of the candles, putting the candles in a place where passersby can see them, because by doing that, we will be mifarsemet hanes, we will be publicizing the miracle. So what was the miracle of Hanukkah? That's a question that people have asked for centuries. My Hanukkah is what's found in the Talmud. And in the Masechet of Shabbat, there's a number of discussions about what exactly was the miracle. And we have a kind of ongoing machloket. It's a dispute of a sort. And that is the miracle the oil that was only supposed to last one day, lasted 8 days, so that the dedication of the temple could take place, and that the oil could be reconstituted kosher-wise, because all of the flasks that were found in the temple were broken, and they couldn't find kosher oil except for one flask, and they used that flask, and it was only enough to last one day, and it lasted 8 days. Is that the miracle? Or is it the miracle that is mentioned and alluded to in the Al Hanisim paragraph of our Amidah that we recite, and Birkat HaMazon that we recite all through the 8 days of Hanukkah? And that is the miracle of the few defeating the many. And it was actually a military miracle that we call the Nes of Hanukkah. So is it a supernatural miracle of the oil lasting 8 days? Or is it a miracle such as similar to the miracle of Purim, where the Jews were on the road to annihilation and they were allowed to defend themselves, and they did so successfully? Or another one that some people say in the 20th century was the miracle of the Yom HaAtzmaut. The fact that we were on our way to annihilation once again at the time of our Declaration of Independence, and we were attacked, and we, even though we're the Ma'at defeating the Harbe, the few defeated the many in a third case, that was indeed a miracle similar to those of Hanukkah and Purim. And in fact, I will tell you that there are some Jews, present company included, who actually recite an Al Hanisim on Yom HaAtzmaut that is found in the conservative Sidur, because I believe, just like the people who recite Hallel with a bracha on Yom HaAtzmaut, the reason is because they too believe that it was miraculous. It was a nes that we came out of the War of Independence with a state. So the question of what the miracle is one that will go on. I am of the school that says that I think the miracle was the military one, but we tell our children that the miracle is the one of the 8 days of oil, because we want to give them that same feeling of excitement and something like fairy tale status. And we don't want to go into the military stuff because that's not appropriate for kids so much. So in the Babylonian Talmud, source 1 teaches us that who is responsible for, who fulfills the mitzvah of lighting the Chanukiah? Is it men? Because after all, it's a mitzvat aseh shazman grama. It is a time-bound mitzvah, and time-bound mitzvot, traditionally, women are exempt from them. But Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi tells us, Isha vadai madlika. No, women are also obligated to light the Chanukiah. Why? Nashim chayavot b'ner Hanukah, she'af hen hayu be'oto hanes. That women are obligated to light the Hanukkah candle, for even they too were part of the same miracle. Now, the question is this the same miracle that I was talking to you about, miracle number 2? It certainly doesn't sound like it's the same miracle number 1. So let's go on and let's look at Masechet Megillah, which is also dealing with exactly the same issue. In the Babylonian Talmud, we have Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi Amar, Nashim chayavot mikra Megillah, she'af hein hayu be'oto hanes. So Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, the same Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi who said that women are obligated to light the Chanukiah as a mitzvah on Hanukkah, said women are obligated to read the Megillah, for even they too were part of the same miracle. There's a pattern here. So what's the commonality of the miracle of Hanukkah and the miracle of Purim? It's not the oil, my friends. It is some kind of victory that they were a part of. So now we're going to have to get some insight into that. So let's look at source number 3. The Tosafot, we're talking about Rashi's grandchildren. They lived in France in the 13th century. For even they too, Sha'af hein hayu be'oto hanes, we're talking about their comment to Tractate Megillah. Rashbam explains that the essence of the miracles was brought about by women. So not only is Rashbam saying that women were a part of the miracle, but rather the women were the instigators that brought about this miracle of Hanukkah. So what's the miracle? Let's go on. On Purim, it was Esther to whom the miracle is attributed. She went to the king, Achashverosh, and said, there's a people that is being persecuted and I need your help. And Achashverosh says, what? You're Jewish? I didn't know that. What can I do? So she said, let the Jews defend themselves. He says, okay, because they couldn't rescind the edict that said that Haman and his people could kill the Jews. He couldn't rescind it, so he made a second law that said that they can defend themselves, and they did with aplomb. On Hanukkah, it was Judith to whom the miracle is attributed. More on that later. That's the essence of our shiur today is Judith. What was the miracle that Judith brought about on Hanukkah? That's a tough question. On Pesach, it was because of the Nashim Tzadkaniyot, the righteous women in that generation, that the nation was redeemed. What is difficult is the language, even they too, as if to say that they are an afterthought in the story. The Tosafot are saying. To make Rashbam's comment make total sense, the Talmud should have reported they were an equal part of the miracle. Thus, it seems to me that certainly on Purim, they were destined to be annihilated, just like the men. And on Pesach, the women were enslaved, just like the men. And on Hanukkah, the decree was directed very much toward the women. You remember the decree on Hanukkah is no circumcision, no studying Torah, etc. So that was what the Tosafot said. It's not so clear. And I think one of the reasons that it's not so clear is because it wasn't so clear to them. I think they pushed and they gave Judith credit, and we got some problems here. So let's continue on to source 4. Rashi, in his commentary, not to the Purim, the Megillah Masechet, but rather to the Masechet Shabbat, which talks about Hanukkah, Rashi says, Hayu be'oto hanes, shegazru Yevanim al kol betulot hanisuot lihibba'el the tafsar tchila ve'al yad isha na'asa hanes. They were a part of the same miracle. Rashi tells us that the Greeks decreed that all virgins about to be married first had to have sex with the tafsar, the high-ranking general, and it was at the hands of a woman that the miracle of Hanukkah took place. Now, do any of you remember anything that happened last week at this time with regards to Bituel? Do you remember what we learned about Bituel and the question of where was he in the negotiations between Lavan and Eliezer when they were taking Rivka back to Canaan to marry Yitzchak? One of the midrashim was that from the beginning of the story until the end, there was this notion that he was a high general, Betuel was, and that he had decreed that all of the virgins had to come to him and have sex with him before they would marry their husbands. And the people said, well, this isn't fair. You're telling us that we have to do this with all of our children, all of our daughters. What about Rivka? So Betuel was about to say, okay, so Rivka too. And the angel came and said, in order not to defile Rivka in this way, we're going to have to kill off Betuel. Well, that's a midrash. And that's the midrash that answers that question that we looked at very closely last week of what happened to Betuel. And the midrash says he died. And the reason he died is because he was a tafsar. And the tafsar has this privilege of sleeping with the virgins, and it was going to be Rivka too, and he died. So that's what sent me on this path to say, wait a minute, tafsar. I know there's a story about the tafsar in the legends of Hanukkah. That's the Babylonian Talmud that Rashi in the 11th century comments on with regards to why it was that women were actively a part of the miracle of Hanukkah. Source 5, we're now jumping to the 16th century. Keep in mind that between the 12th century and the 16th century, there were disputations. There was a development of the kind of halakha that we are living today in a lot of ways, because Yosef Karo and the Moshe Isserlis were establishing a code of Jewish law and Jewish behavior. So we're now jumping to the more codified texts, not the codification that came about as a result of the Talmud, but rather the taking of those Talmudic statements and putting them into codified laws, such as the Shulchan Aruch. That's Spain. So Yosef Karo tells us in source 5, Isha madleket ner Hanukah, shaf hi chayevet ba. A woman may kindle the Hanukkah candle, for she too is obligated. He doesn't go into any details, but the Ramah, Moshe Isserlis of Polish descent, who is advocating for the Ashkenazic community, says, and every time you see the Haggah that means gloss. Yesh omrim sheyesh le'echol gevina b'Hanukah, lefi shehanes na'asa b'chalav she'echila Yehudit et ha'oyev. Hang with me here, my friends. Moshe Isserles says that there are those who say that one should eat cheese on Hanukkah because the miracle happened with milk or curds, which Judith fed the enemy. How many people here of Ashkenazic descent know that cheese is something that we're supposed to be eating on Hanukkah? Can I see a show of hands? Not a lot of you. I'm seeing a lot of shaking of heads, but no showing of hands. And yet, my friends, it's in the Shulchan Aruch. It's the Ramah, which is the Ashkenazic counterpart, that says that it's a tradition to eat cheese on Hanukkah because of the curds which Judith fed the enemy. All right, we've got plenty of time. Let's explore this comment. Not only that, but let's go now to Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan, the Mishnah Brura, which has become over time the established, elaborated legal code of the Ashkenazic community. He lived in Russia in the 19th into the 20th century, relatively recent, and his comments are the ones that many of us have studied and have observed as far as the evolution of our halachic observance. He says the following, in comment to what the Ramah said in the Shulchan Aruch. שאף היא חייבת בה, שהנס היה גם להן, שהגזירה הייתה על כל בתולה הניסית שתיבעל להגמון תחילה, וגם התשועה נעשתה על ידי אישה שבת יוחנן כהן גדול חתכה ראשו של ראש הצוררים. She too is obligated, is what the Ramah says. The miracle affected the women as well. So he's backtracking on the, not just that the women were not the instigators of the path to the miracle, but rather they were affected. For the decree was on all of the virgins about to be married, that they first had to have sex with the army general, and the salvation took place at the hands of a woman, the daughter of Yochanan, the high priest, who cut off the head of the leader of the enemies. So I don't know how many of you are math people, but if A equals B and B equals C, then it stands to reason that A equals C. So could we say that the daughter of Yochanan, the high priest, is equal to Judith, Yehudit, if we're following all of these different elements here? So we're going to have to find Judith, the daughter of Yochanan the high priest, who cut off the head of the leader of the enemies, and see if we can't put that all together. So let's continue in our following the sources, and let's go to another source of the Mishnah Brura, and that is the answer to the question: is Yehudit, is Judith the daughter of Yochanan the high priest, and is she the one that cut off the head of the bad guy? So in section 670, we're told by the Mishnah Brura, She'echila Yehudit, which Judith fed the enemy. She was the daughter of Yochanan, the high priest. There was a decree that all engaged women first have sex with the tafsar, and she fed the head of the enemy's cheese to get him drunk and cut off his head, and the enemies all fled in terror. It's been established now, according to the Mishnah Brura, that Judith was indeed the daughter of the high priest, of Yochanan, the high priest, and she cut off the head. The problem is that source 9 gives us a couple of pieces here that are not about Judith, but they're rather about another woman who is a heroine in our Jewish tradition, namely Yael. So let's look at Judges, that's Shoftim. Now we're back into our Tanakh. We've left the rabbinic evolution, the rabbinic development, and we're going back into Tanakh to see if we can't come up with some information about the three pieces that we have to deal with. Number one is the woman having to sleep with the tafsar, the high general. Number 2, feeding of cheese. Number 3, cutting off the head. That's what we've been told is the reason that we eat cheese on Hanukkah is because of all of those 3 historical events. However, we've got a problem, Houston. Let's look at chapter 4 of, this is when Devorah, Haniviyah, the prophet Devorah, and her sidekick, Barak, were freeing the Jews from the subjugations that they were subjected to during this time of Devorah. One of the stories is found in chapter 4 of the book of Judges, and it goes like this. Sisera, meanwhile, had fled on foot to the tent of Yael, wife of Hever, the Kenite, not Yochanan the high priest, for there was a friendship between King Yavin of Chatzor and the family of Hever the Kenite. And by the way, for those of you who are still in the Midrash mode, not Breshit, but the Midrash mode is that Hever is one of the 7 names given to Yitro, Jethro, father-in-law of Moses. So we're making that connection that the Canaanites were actually Midianites. Anyway, so they were friends because they had a long history together. Yael came out to greet Sisera and said to him, "Come in, my lord, come in here. Do not be afraid." So he entered her tent and she covered him with a blanket. He said to her, "Please let me have some water. I am thirsty." She opened a skin of milk, ding, 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 and gave him some to drink, and she covered him again. He said to her, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you if there's anybody here, say no." Then Yael, wife of Hever, took a tent pin and grasped the mallet. When he was fast asleep from exhaustion, she approached him stealthily and drove the pin through his temple till it went down to the ground. Thus he died. So here we do have the element of the cheese, that is to say the milk, but we don't have it being dispensed by Yehudit, and we don't have a head cutting incident, but rather we have a tent pin incident where she rams his head through with a tent pin. So we have one of the 3 elements. Is that enough? So please come with me to the book of Judith, because after all, this is what the rabbis are telling us, is that Judith was the one who was the daughter of Yochanan the high priest, who was the Hanukah Yochanan the high priest, Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Chashmonai Uvanav. We have the beginning of the Al-Hanisim paragraph that makes reference to Matityahu, that was the son of the Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So maybe Matityahu and Yehudit were brother and sister. But let's look at the story found in the book of Judith, chapter 14. Now, let me just tell you that the book of Judith is an apocryphal book. All right? That means that it was a part of those texts that either didn't make it into the Jewish canon, our Tanakh, because it was considered to be a subversive text, or what I think happened is that the story of Hanukkah took place around the 2nd century, the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, 165 BCE, something like that. And it just was too late to make it into the canon, but it was still documented, the story of Hanukkah. And so it was an extra book. And it was only extra, not because of its holy nature, but because it just didn't make the deadline that was given by the rabbi, not the rabbis, but those who were canonizing, who were saying, okay, no more inners, as we say in the world of tag. And so it just didn't make it, but it was still important. And so we have this book of Judith, which is one of the apocryphal books. And in chapter 14, we have the following. It grew late, and his staff hurried away. Bagoas closed the tent from the outside, having shown out those who still lingered in the Lord's presence. They went to their beds, wearied with too much drinking. and Judith was left alone in the tent with Holofernes, who had collapsed wine-sodden on his bed. Judith then told her maid to stay just outside the bedroom and wait for her to come out, as she did every morning. She had let it be understood that she would be going out to her prayers and had also spoken of her intention to Bagoas. By now, everyone had left Holofernes, and no one, either important or unimportant, was left in the bedroom. By the way, Judith was allowed to be so close to Holofernes because she was a beautiful woman. She was a spy from the Jewish camp, and she had cozied up to Holofernes, similar to Fang Fang. I don't know, Hamevin Yavin. Anyway, so standing beside the bed, Judith murmured to herself, Lord God, to whom all strength belongs, prosper what my hands are now to do for the greater glory of Jerusalem. Listen to this greatness of this woman, Judith. Now is the time to recover your heritage and to further my plans to crush the enemies arrayed against us. With that, by the way, I just want to say to you that her speech is very similar to the impression that we get from Esther, who was also going to do this great thing for the Jewish people. She had to be pushed by Mordechai, of course, but she did this great thing for the Jewish people in a similar manner. With that, she went up to the bedpost by Holofernes' head and took down his scimitar. Coming closer to the bed, she caught him by the hair and said, "Make me strong today, Lord God of Israel." Twice she struck at his neck with all her might and cut off his head. Aha! We have the Judith and we have the head cutting. Then she rolled his body off the bed and pulled down the canopy from the bedpost, after which she went out and gave the head of Holofernes to her maid, who put it in her food bag. And then she was going to go off to visit grandmother in the cottage. No, that's a different legend. The two then left the camp together, as they always did when they went to pray. Once they were out of the camp, they skirted the ravine, climbed the slope to Betulia, and made for the gates. From a distance, Judith shouted to the guards on the gates, "Open the gates, open, for the Lord our God was with us still, displaying his strength in Israel and his might against our enemies, as he has done today." I am so excited at this point because I found Judith and I found the head cutting. Where's the cheese? There's no cheese in this story. Not only that, but there's no Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So we got some of the elements are here, but some of the elements are terribly missing. So we're going to have to go to page 5 and another source, and this is the source of the book of Maccabees, also pseudepigraphal or apocryphal, sorry. It's the Apocrypha has another one. Judith, I'm sorry, I was telling you before about the book of Maccabees, which happened in the 2nd century. Judith, we don't know the timing. Holofernes was supposedly between the 6th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. She was not the daughter of Yochanan. Yes, Joel.
Book of Judith says it happened in the time of Nebuchadnezzar.
That's 6th century.
Right.
So we're talking 586 is Nebuchadnezzar destroying the temple.
And it
So
also
that's
gives
possible.
it also gives Judith's lineage, which is no way involved any high priest.
You got it. Okay. She was said to be married to Menashe from the tribe of Shimon.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry, Yochanan Kohen Gadol, that's a different family. All right.
Right.
So we still have a problem. So now let's look at the actual story of Hanukkah, because isn't that what we're talking about here? Is why we eat cheese on Hanukkah? So there is in the first book of Maccabees, there's the following story. It's pretty dry. So please stay with me here. The armies met in battle on the 13th day of the month Adar. Wait a minute, the 13th day of the month Adar? That's not Hanukkah, that's Purim. Let's keep going. Nicanor's army was crushed, and he himself was the first to fall in the battle. When his army saw that Nicanor had fallen, they threw down their weapons and fled. The Jews pursued them a day's journey from Adasan to near Gazara, blowing the trumpets behind them as signals. From all the surrounding villages of Judea, people came out and outflanked them. They turned them back, and all the enemies fell by the sword. Not a single one escaped. This sounds to me like the miracle of Hanukkah to me. Then the Jews collected the spoils and the plunder. They cut off Nicanor's head and his right arm, which he had lifted up so arrogantly. Then they brought and displayed in the sight of Jerusalem. The people rejoiced greatly and observed that day as a day of much joy. We'll call it Purim. They decreed that it should be observed every year on the 13th of Adar. And so for a few days, the land of Judah was at rest. So here we come in the book of Hanukkah, that is to say the book of Maccabees, yet another case of a person being, their neck being severed, which I can't advocate. I'm just relating to the historical pieces that are being brought here. And that brought power and strength and courage to the Jewish people, which seems to me to be pretty much what we're talking about when we're talking about the miracle of Hanukkah, which we're supposed to publicize in the lighting of the candles. So,
Still
my
no
friends,
cheese.
what's that, Bob?
But still no cheese.
But still no cheese. So what happened? If there was ever a case of conflation in our Jewish tradition, it's the rabbis of the Mishnah, the Shulchan Aruch, and the Mishnah Brewer later on, telling us that we should be eating cheese on Hanukkah, because they took 3 stories and they took a little bit out of each of these stories. And I'm going to tell you that there is another a story of Antiochus found in Midrash Maaseh Hanukah, which we don't know exactly when it was. We believe that it was probably around the 17th century of the Common Era. There's a book called Otzar Midrashim, who, in light of the story of Hanukkah, enacted decrees which some of the people, in order not to follow the awful laws, stopped observing their Judaism. This story is found in the collections of Midrashim, which were first published in the middle of the 19th century, but they are from earlier centuries. And that is the following. The story is that the daughter of Matityahu, who we know from Hanukkah, the son of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, was to be married, some say the daughter of Yochanan himself, but because of the decree that she first had to sleep with the Tafsar, the army general, or some other Assyrian dignitary, her brothers, Judah, Yochanan, Yonatan, Shimon, and Elazar, weren't they the sons of Matityahu? They got together to defend her honor, and they killed the general and cut off his head. The story continues that some of the people were afraid of the repercussions of this gallant act by the brothers, and Judith, a widow not related to anyone in the story, steps forward and seduces the king, cuts off his head in 2 blows, and seals the victory for the Israelites. So when we talk about conflation, this is a wonderful example of pieces of Jewish lore, including Yael and the cheese, Judith and Holofernes cutting off his head, Nicanor having his head cut off, and the victory was one that was exalted by the Jewish people. We don't have any source for the sons of Yochanan going against Antiochus, except we do have the commonality of their sister. What was her name? Miriam? Miriam, who was supposed to be sleeping with the Tafsar before she gets married, because that was the rule of the virgins at that time. What was that time? Well, that same story is the one that is told about what was they're saying it's the story related to Hanukkah, but that's not why Judith got involved. Judith got involved because the victory of the Jews was being celebrated and there might have been repercussions. So Judith came up and she killed the leader in order to quell the possible reprisals that would come to the Jews because of their having cut off the head of Antiochus, or the Tafsar, whoever the Tafsar was. It's all a complete, I'm not going to say misuse, because that's heretical, but I'm going to say that the conflation and the taking of bits and pieces from many of these known Jewish legends brings about the rabbis who want to say, so what's the halacha? What are the rules and regulations? What are we supposed to do, as opposed to, oh, these are nice stories? And someone, and we don't know where it came up from, someone came up with, oh, we should eat cheese on Hanukkah because of the story of, and then I got to just list this whole set of occurrences that we've learned today in our story. Because the cheese is from Yael. The head chopping, the head cutting is from Judith, which is apocryphal, or from the first book of Maccabees. That's where that comes from. The Tafsar, the story, the legend of the general sleeping with the virgins, that has its place in many places, because we also found it in the story of Betuel even. But the idea there was to make the bad guys look bad and the good guys look good. And that, my friends, is the bottom line of the Pirsuma Nisa, the establishing this mitzvah, the one mitzvah on Hanukkah, which is not found in our Torah. If we say 613 mitzvot are mitzvot found in the Torah, I'm sorry, but the story of Hanukkah came a lot later. But the rabbis who were given the authority to interpret as we are to interpret said it's a mitzvah to do this Pirsuma Nisa, this publicizing of the miracle. And women too are obligated to have a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah aseh. It's a positive mitzvah for women to do the same mitzvah, because they too were hein hayu be'oto hanes. They were a part of it. How were they a part of it? I'll give you Judith. I'll give you Esther. I'll give you the Nashim Tzadkaniyot. But it doesn't matter anymore, because we were a part of that miracle of these few defeating the many, and men and women were both a part of it. And if we want to say that women were the instigators of the creation of the confidence and the victory came from the brave courage of women, I think that's a fine thing to do. And we can certainly run with that and have a nice cheese sandwich on their behalf on Hanukkah. Chag Chanukah Sameach, everybody. Deborah, being a woman, of course, you have the last word.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard.
Thank you, Howard. That was really magnificent shiur to help us get in the spirit of Hanukkah. And I'm setting up my Hanukah for tonight. And thanks to all of you. And look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks, not next week, but the week after. And a reminder that in that week, on Wednesday, the 23rd, Shuli Mishkin will be leading a virtual tour of the Muslim Quarter. That's at 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. in America. So share with your friends and family as well, because it's a perfect opportunity for them to join. And a lot of people in America are actually already on vacation because it's Erev, the other holiday. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Okay, wait a second. Before you go, how do we greet people this week? Is it Shabbat Shalom and Chag Chanukah Sameach, or is it Chag Chanukah Sameach and Shabbat Shalom? The answer is Tadir v'she'eno Tadir, Tadir Kodem. So we say Shabbat first and then Hanukkah afterwards. Not for tomorrow, but when it's Shabbat, Shabbat wins the first spot.